approval of the committee agenda and work plan. Opposed? Abstentions? Item 4 of our minutes from the November 7th lunch committee meeting open session. All those in favor say aye. Opposed?
Let's take a whole row.
All right, so number 3 is our federal legislative review. We have our Honorable John Hampton here to give us the news from Washington, D.C. And I know we've had some, we're just glad that you're here. And
sorry for the drama this
no,
morning.
I think a little drama never been fun. We can handle it.
An old lawyer's trick to heighten things in anticipation.
Well, then it better be really amazing report, so we're looking forward to it.
Well, thank you.
So,
I guess if we could go to the videotape here.
Call up.
and as our practice, I think, John, as people on the committee have questions, feel free to chime in, or we'll kind of take questions as
Please.
you go.
And I'll try to move along briskly here because I know you have this 1 o'clock meeting coming up. And a lot of what I have on the list is sort of, they're agenda items, and there may not be much going on now, but there may be actions that Congress is going to take in the future on these issues. And so I want you to just kind of have it all, the totality in mind. So some of it I've been through before. I'll skip through pretty quickly today just to remind you that it's there, but since nothing's happening, we'll move on to things that are more ripe. I wanted to start out today with a discussion of the election outlook, because I think that's going to be the prism through which much of the congressional action in the coming year is going to be viewed. Also, federal budget milestones, that's going to set kind of the schedule for key developments in the Congress. Tax reform, infrastructure. These are a series of kind of other issues where there have been developments I wanted to bring to your attention, and others, as I say, just to kind of remind you that it's there. So to start out, and these are drawn from some slides that Charlie Cook, who's really I think the champion congressional election prognosticator, put together, just to give you kind of a sense of the framework and help explain, why a lot of what's you're reading about in the newspapers about gridlock and partisanship are happening. But on the House side, which is the first topic, there's 17 seats that the Democrats need to win to take over. Now, 17 doesn't sound like a big number until you see what they have to do to get there. And basically, as Charlie Cook points out, the Democrats have to run the table to win the House back. They have to win not only all of their solid Democratic seats, 161, the likely Democratic seats, 14, the lean Democratic, 15, the toss-up, 14, and 14 of the 16 lean Republican districts. So they sort of ran the table on the Senate races in 2012, but on the House side, and especially with retirements of some of these members that are in kind of swing districts, it's going to be a challenge because, as you'll see here, this is sort of the competitive race, 76 races out of 435 seats. Only about 15% of the seats are competitive. And what that means is that the middle is gone from Congress. The middle in the Republican side, the middle in the Democratic side. And so what you have are situations in which people are really kind of locked in on their side of the aisle. And the ability of people and the willingness to reach across the aisle, if you only have 15% of your seats are in jeopardy of losing, then I think it's going to be very hard to sort of step out of your partisan bailiwick and to reach across to work with the other side. So I think that's very telling on why it is that nothing seems to happen in the House in terms of the big bills working together. I mean, they started to pass some bipartisan measures like the Farm Bill, but that was a pretty critical initiative for the Republican constituency as well. On the Senate side, right now, the Democrats hold 55 seats, the Republicans 45. But here again, it's kind of the same breakdown, and this is again all from Charlie Cook's analysis. What you see here is that 56% of the Senate Democrats are in either Republican-leaning states or swing territories. So 56% of the Democratic seats are, sort of in play, if you will. And I think that has caused at least some of the Democrats to be taking more moderate positions in the Senate. But the next slide, I think, is the most revealing. This is the Republican side. 77% of all Republican seats are in Republican states. And so you'll see that it's the Republican concentration sort of goes from left to right. So as you get further to the right, you have the stronger Republican. So it literally is translated into primaries from folks on the right are the biggest threat because they're not facing a need to run to the middle to the electorate. So if anything, the dynamic is, and there's sort of a certain irony, and you can't really survive in Washington as a lobbyist unless you have an interest in irony and black humor. But there's a certain irony that in the wake of Citizens United, which was seen as sort of unleashing the Republican floodgates of spending to support Republican candidates, what's happening now is that much of that money is now being used against Republican incumbents, like Mitch McConnell, for example. The Republican leader in the Senate is facing this primary challenge that's being funded with huge dollar amounts from these kind of shadowy groups that are making use of Citizens United. So, I guess be careful what you wish for. Here again, this is a breakdown of the seats that are up. Democratic seats are in the top row, Republican seats are in the lower row. Again, the right to left is Democratic. As you get closer to the middle, that's toss-up. As you move to the right on that chart, those are Republican-leaning states. And one of the things that, if you see it on your television screen, little asterisks on the Republican-leaning states in which Democrats are having to run, there are quite a few empty seats, open seats. Senator Baucus in Montana, Begich Tim Johnson in South Dakota, Republican area, Rockefeller in West Virginia. I mean, all these are open seats being given up by sort of lions of the Senate. So I think it's going to be a challenging year for the Democrats. To field a candidate to replace a Jay Rockefeller is a daunting challenge in coal country. And so I think there's going to be a pickup of Republican seats. The question really is, are they going to pick up enough to the 6+ that they need to take over the Senate? I mean, there's some surprises down in Georgia. Senator Sam Nunn's daughter, Michelle Nunn, has proved to be a very viable and strong fundraiser on the Democratic side. It's an open seat. They have the Republican cast of thousands that are busy carving each other up for not being pure enough. So it may be that there'll be a couple of Republican seats that could swing the other way. Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, has this challenge from the Tea Party fellow on the right that he's having to concentrate on for a primary, but he's got a young woman who's a Secretary of State who's proven to be an attractive candidate, then he's going to have the race of his life. So we'll just have to kind of see how that works, but I think there's still going to be sort of a net pickup of Republican seats. But part of what's happening in Congress has affected the California delegation, and I kind of got the idea to do this after watching the Grammys, and at the end they show all the musicians who died during the year, and you didn't read the paper that day. My God, he died? So I thought, there've been all these retirements. Let's go back and look, because the roster is pretty amazing of folks that have left the Congress either through retirement or in a couple of cases defeat. And for example, Bill Thomas, I mean, he was our guy on Elk Hill's Medicare Part B. He's our guy, and he was mean. I mean, that's an ideal combination as a champion. He's now stepped down, and David Dreyer. It's Democrats and Republicans alike. The chairman of the Rules Committee, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Buck McKeon, Armed Services. Howard Berman was defeated last year, but George Miller and Henry Waxman. I mean, you're losing tremendous institutional memory. And one of the things that is not always immediately apparent is that what happens when you lose that sort of institutional memory is that the oversight of executive programs takes a big drop. because George Miller will say, well, I remember when we passed that education bill, this is what we were trying to do, and you haven't implemented it properly. If you got some guys just elected, he has no clue what that was about. And I think, these are people that like to get things done, and with the current climate, it just, I think it rankles folks. I mean, George Miller said, well, these new guys, they don't even look you in the eye when you go by them in the hall, So I think and it's happening on the Republican side as well. And in other states, some of the moderate Republicans are just feeling unwelcome, and so they're stepping down. But it's a pretty dramatic drop in California's clout, which translates into our ability to kind of work to get things done, because the other half of the Congress will get up half an hour early to stick it to California if they could, because they perceive California as always taking an undue share of whatever it is that's being handed out. So we still have some formidable folks, Senator Feinstein and Boxer. They're both now in senior positions. Kevin McCarthy, who we've worked with on Alec Hills, is the number 3 Republican. Nancy Pelosi, of course, is hoping to become a speaker again at some point. And several others, Maxine Waters, who we work with very closely on issues and has been a good friend. But, you can't really sort of make up anytime soon that kind of clout. And it just affects our ability to get things done. You've got new folks in the delegation that don't, have the historic memory when we used to have to do the delegation letter on Elk Hills, where it was just talk about herding the cats to get the 52 disparate personalities onto the letter. You had these folks, the longer-serving members on both sides, sort of, they'd answer the call. This was a good for California issue, so they'd put aside their partisan differences. It doesn't kind of work this way with the younger folks, because a lot of times the model now is not to have come up through state government. So a lot of these guys have never even voted on a library board budget, let alone the federal budget. So there's no one factor that's contributing to kind of what's perceived as the gridlock. It's all these things kind of happening together, and as a result, I think Congress has suffered. So anyway, just to give you kind of an outlook on the federal budget milestones, because the budget is sort of, and crises and manufactured crises has kind of tended to drive the congressional schedule. Upcoming is the next sort of potential crisis is the debt ceiling, the U.S. borrowing, ability to continue borrowing. The question is, are the House Republicans going to pull the pin out of the grenade and wave it around again this year? They seem to be somewhat chastened. They're not sure. They want to get something for it, but they can't decide what it is. So they're now sort of floundering around on what to do. I think they feel burned for having, sort of played Russian roulette with the creditworthiness of the U.S., but it's still going to be something that has to get through, and I think there's going to be some pushing and shoving before it actually does, so that could affect the markets in the near term. The administration's budget, which kind of kicks off the budget cycle, is going to come out in March. It's delayed because normally I come out and talk about what's in it, but it's been delayed this year because of the delay in the congressional appropriation schedule. The budget deal that was reached at the end of last year was a 2-year budget, so it kind of, what that does is it sets the overall size of the pie on total spending, and the appropriators have to come back and carve it up. They did so over the holidays, and whether they can now kind of somewhat get back to regular order, I think is going to be the big challenge in terms of whether Congress can get anything done this year. The other potential milestone is a political landmine. Just to sort of, for those of you that are going to be interested in the elections, you recall the cancellation of the individual policies right before the end of the year created quite a tumult from people whose insurance was being canceled, had to sign up on the new Affordable Care Act, the health exchanges, and there was a lot of angst about that. Well, the next one coming up could be an even greater landmine. That's when the small business employer policies get canceled, again for the same reason that supposedly they don't measure up to the benchmarks that the Affordable Care Act has. So, and by a clever act of timing, that's going to occur in October, right before the November election. So, I mean, hate to think about it, but the Obamacare could end up, cheating the Democrats not only in 2010 but in 2014 out of seats. Tax reform, I just bring it up. I've been through this a couple times, and I know the word tax probably causes the eyes to glaze over, especially after lunch. But I bring it up just because House Ways and Means Chairman Camp is going to start moving a bill in March. He's going to put his package out, and on the Senate side, the tax reform's been slowed up a little bit with a changeover. Max Baucus, is the current Finance Committee chairman, has been appointed ambassador to China. Ron Wyden from Oregon is going to be taking over, so tax reform's going to kind of slow down a little bit. But this is the kind of thing when I say I just want to remind you it's on the agenda because we have some exposure. I mean, we've got these special rules for governmental plans that under a reformed, simplified system might go away, one size fits all. And then employer pickups, which I know is important, obviously, to the workforce, in which employee contributions to the plan are done on a pre-tax basis. That's sort of a uniqueness to state and local plans. Almost $5 billion over 10 years is the revenue pickup from that. So if they're shopping around for offsets to pay for a 25% tax rate, things like this could end up being on the table. And also, as I went through before, CalSTRS as an investor, the changes that are being proposed for tax treatment in the financial markets, financial products, marking financial instruments to market and paying tax currently. Obviously, you're tax exempt, but it just affects pricing and that kind of thing in the marketplace. Same thing with investment vehicles. Chairman Camp in the Ways and Means Committee has talked about doing away with all these fancy allocations for these investment partnerships that you often invest in, where they squirt all the income to the tax-exempt partners and all the losses to the taxable partners. All those sorts of things could change, and again, it has an impact on the investment opportunities that are available to you. So we keep an eye on them and work with the investment staff. And the investment staff had asked us to brief you on this infrastructure legislation that is pending in the Congress now. I know this is an area Tom's been interested in. I know there's a range of views about, maybe even on the board here of, can we just do this through tax-exempt bonds? Is this the way to go? But there's clearly interest in Congress. This is a measure that's introduced by Congressman John Delaney, who's a freshman from Maryland, who likes to point out that he's the only former CEO of a publicly traded company serving in Congress. He's introduced this with about 50 Democratic and Republican co-sponsors in the Senate. The measure is Senator Bennett from Colorado, Democrat from Colorado, and Roy Blunt, who's a Republican senator from Missouri. And they're trying to kind of think outside the box on ways to encourage, in this case, private capital to flow into sort of a government-administered fund, but the one that does not rely on federal funding. And that's kind of the new idea that is being shopped around. And basically, the concept is to create this fund that would provide loans and guarantees and even, to some extent, equity investments for state and local infrastructure projects. And the theory of the sponsors is that state and local government should have skin in the game in this exercise, and so therefore they have to repay at quote-unquote market rate, so it's not a completely subsidized investment. And they're proposing to fund this with $50 billion of these infrastructure bonds that have a 50-year term and a 1% interest rate, no federal guarantee. It sounds like, who's going to buy that? But they've come up with sort of a clever way to pay for it. I think it's going to be controversial because it takes away one of the funding pots that was going to be used to pay for tax reform, and that is, as you've probably been reading in the papers, U.S. multinationals, especially in the tech and pharma, have all these foreign earnings offshore that they haven't brought home because they claim the tax rate's too high. This would try to tap that money, which is $1.7 trillion at the last estimate, and say basically these companies, if they would invest in these 50-year 1% bonds, for every dollar they invest in the bonds, they could bring back $4 of these foreign earnings tax-free. So it's a new way of trying to think about things. I think it's going to be controversial, but it's it's catching some attention. 50 in this environment, to get 50 co-sponsors, Democrat and Republican alike, I think is quite a badge of honor. Unfortunately, I think given the current sort of congressional situation, this is probably not a time for big ideas. I mean, they're both Republican and Democratic leadership are kind of playing in the parlance of baseball small ball. They don't want to make a mistake that can be used against them in the election. They don't want to give the other side credit for doing something that's actually constructive. So as a result, ideas like this that could be appealing and fill a pretty critical need to help, just another source of financing and capital for these infrastructure projects. But, ideas like this, sometimes they're several years in germination, and at least this is a way to proceed without federal funding, because federal funding, I think, is going to be challenging in this budget environment to try to rely on for this. And that's what this other bill by Congressman Neal from Massachusetts, federal appropriation for this fund. Well, that's, in an ideal world that would happen. I don't think it's going to happen in this day and age. And what the other thing that this proposal tries to do that I think had some interest for the investment staff was that it's trying to sort of get the quote-unquote public-private partnerships as a sort of a vehicle for infrastructure kind of going by providing some seed money. At least 25% of the fund had to be allocated to these public-private partnerships, which had to use at least 20% of their capital from private sources. So, as we know, there's sort of a ethos in America that, we don't want to become a nation of toll roads. So I think one of the challenges in this is always, as I'm sure Chris and his team have indicated, where do you get the funding source to service this debt? And so that's been one of the challenges up until now, and I think is going to still be one to contend with in this environment. The Windsor decision on same-sex marriage, I know that's attracted a lot of attention, and pension funds and employee benefits is a key area where that has a real impact. And as I indicated when I was out here before, the IRS has issued guidance in sort of stages, but I think the folks who administer plans are really waiting for the key guidance in terms of what you do for the past, because basically what the IRS has said, same-sex spouse, that's a spouse for federal tax laws related to plans. They're going to look to the state where the marriage took place. Was it valid in that state? Then people can start moving around, and they're not going to worry about where they're living now, which I think is a sensible thing. But the key thing is on quote-unquote retroactivity, because you've got all these people in the plans now that are affected in terms of their benefits, potentially in terms of just beneficiary designations, rollovers, death benefits. There are a whole series of rules that are sort of tailored to deal with the spousal situation. The question is, what are plans supposed to do for elections have been made in the past, and what types of amendments. And the IRS has said they're going to be issuing guidance, quote, soon, which, under their sort of Gregorian calendar can mean weeks or months. But I think it's coming, reasonably soon, because plans are, all in your position, which they're kind of waiting, you know what you can do kind of going forward to change your processes and tailor the plan, make changes as necessary going forward. But in terms of things that have been done in the past, to what extent does the plan have to go back for elections that have already made, people that have already retired? Because again, this was a constitutional right. This isn't some law that changed. So in theory, it's a right that always existed. It didn't suddenly just spring up on the date of the Supreme Court's decision. So those are challenges. I mean, if I had to guess, I think the IRS is going to be liberal in permitting plans that want to do things to try to be helpful to people, but I think they're going to be careful about mandating that plans make changes that have costs to the plan, to the employer, where the employer and the plan have been operating on what the rules were and making decisions accordingly. So I think that's the balancing, and that's kind of the tricky part. So stay tuned. We'll be obviously funneling that guidance to the CalSTRS staff to help administer. But I think there'll be changes that'll be necessary that you'll be hearing about in the coming changes to the plan.
John, I'm going to just interject because I know we're short on time, and I had a couple of
Sure.
things I wanted to get your thoughts on. So if that's okay,
That's fine.
and then you can highlight.
I'm sort of.
And I also wondered, are the slides available for us that we could
Sure.
somehow we could get a copy of the slides?
Yeah.
Because I would like
are they
to
up
kind
on your
of
screen, or?
look over. Yeah, they're on here. I'd
Okay,
love
well,
just like
here,
electronic
I brought
copy.
a hard copy, so they
Okay,
can.
great. But a couple of things I wanted to ask you about when you were talking about kind of the political layout around the country is, because I know like Senator Harkin is retiring or
Yes.
retired.
So retire at the end of this year.
So I just wondered if you had a sense of like, do we have some champions around the country for retirement security? And because it seems like the names that I've heard in the last couple of years a lot of those folks are leaving. And so I just wondered if there are people that you can identify that are really kind of
Well, I
championing.
think that's a big challenge. I mean, I think someone like Senator Wyden from Oregon is going to need to be a new focus because he's taking over as chairman of the Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction over us. We're kind of governed by the tax laws. Senator Harkin was chairman of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, and he was a very strong advocate for retirement security. And it's there's really a brain drain going on, and I think some of the younger members, I mean, even, for example, Congressman Jim Gerlach from Philadelphia, or from the Pennsylvania Republican, he had sort of stepped up on the Republican side of Ways and Means Committee to become sort of the champion of retirement security and working with Congressman Neal from Massachusetts, and he was kind of the last vestige of the way things used to be in terms of he served in state government for 15 years, so he doesn't think state employees are evil. And he was a big proponent of retirement security, and I think he was a guy who likes to get things done that is now stepping aside. So I think that's the challenge because you're really having to move into the next generation. And I think on the Senate side, at least, Senator Cardin and Senator Cardin from a Democrat from Maryland, Senator Rob Portman, who's a Republican from Ohio, they had worked together, served together on the House Ways and Means Committee. We worked very closely with them on retirement issues because they became sort of the gurus. They're now over in the Senate, and Senator Portman is not on the tax committee yet. But I think there's hope that they'll begin to reprise their role. But you don't replace a Senator Harkin. You don't replace a committee chairman. That was the reason I was putting up that prior slide because. When Bill Thomas was there, he was very, he'd been a CalSTRS member. He taught at Bakersfield College for many years, so he got it on what public plans were. You just don't replace somebody like that, and so it's a matter of kind of hit and miss. And one of the troubles with the gridlock is that these bills, you look at they passed the fewest number of laws last year in history, even fewer than under the Harry Truman Do Nothing Congress. Things like the Reducing Flight Delays Act. Well, how's that working for you? So the problem is that they're not these sort of bills going through at the committee level. The committees have sort of atrophied, and the committee level was where someone could take an interest in an issue like that. They'd sort of capture that area and say, okay, I'm going to be the person on retirement security, and then they'd become a sort of a vehicle for people like us to come in with ideas and say, Senator Harkin had this Retirement USA plan that was going to be a way to try to get people into retirement plans that was centrally administered through sort of auto enrollment and contribution check off, for those employers that didn't want to offer a plan. Like it was sort of like Social Security in the private sector. And to put forward a proposal like that takes work. It takes trying to build support for it. And if the committees aren't sort of functioning to move these things through, members just say, well, why am I going to go to all this effort and then nothing is ever going to happen? And so that's what makes it sort of complicated.
And John, maybe you can follow up on that because I know we
Sure.
kind of have 5 minutes at or 10 minutes? Okay.
Okay.
Because the thing that you're raising, I know, Senator Kevin DeLeon passed, SB 1234 here, the Secure Choice Act, and I wondered if what you're alluding to about kind of hopefully some influence around the country in terms of thinking about secure retirement for, private employees. And do you see, I understand what you're saying. It's pretty much we're in a quagmire right now, but do you see any movement happening with something like 1234 in California happening in other states?
I think that that's one where in other states they say we have enough problems ourselves. Let's kind of tend to our own knitting in terms of the state plans. And I mean that's and the irony and all this sort of fracas over public plans. And public plans are performing. They're paying benefits. They're providing retirement security. And one of the NEARS, that's why the NEARS, National Institute for Retirement Security, they've been very helpful in pointing out, hey, there's a retirement crisis over on the private side. I mean, the average balance of a 401k plan at retirement is shocking. And so there's been so much attention focused on us that I think that's the coming crisis. And I think people are just...
I'm shocked that we don't talk about that more. I'm shocked that is not what legislators are talking about, is this incredible retirement crisis that all of Americans are, dealing with. And
I agree. It's something that I think is just growing and growing. Even even teachers who have a pension in CalSTRS, we don't have Social Security. So there's definitely and then folks in the private sector have 401ks that have done horribly, and it's so I do think I am shocked that that's not a bigger
Well, part of it,
conversation.
I think, is the whole entitlement debate, Social Security, Medicare changes. I mean, that's where the money can be really saved if they want to. But both sides, I mean, it's the political third rail. You first. It's kind of the approach. And so I think to some extent that kind of carries over to retirement security because there has to be kind of a universal fix because the private plans are sort of the three-legged stool of private plans, Social Security, and personal savings. It kind of brings that whole debate to the fore, and they try various things. These, my IRA that the president's proposed and the Senator Harkin's proposal, but a lot of it's just to get people to save, and I think employers are getting out of the retirement business. There's no question about it. They love to get out of the healthcare business too,
Right.
but they've gotten out of the retirement business. That's the whole movement to the DC plan, flip the risk over there, not my problem anymore, and then kind of the coup de grace, as I mentioned before, was in the private sector DB plans. They have to use these bond rates as discount rates for their funding, which jacks up their liabilities, drives up their costs, and so it's not an encouraging situation if everyone's shifted over to these DC plans that kind of depend on personal savings ability. But it's clearly it's a problem. It's a major problem. So I wish I had better answers about how it's going to be solved, but you're right that the governmental plan community and the retirement community really needs to begin to look for new champions because there's a definite passing of the generation. Senator Rockefeller had a strong interest in it.
Okay.
Are there other questions that folks had?
Terry's got it.
More of a comment and maybe inappropriate editorializing. I think the bigger issue is just the economics of what has happened to the American middle class over the last 40 years and the actual purchasing power. The statistics are what they are. The facts are what they are. And it's basically been the erosion of the middle class in America.
Well, if your income's
And the
stagnating,
inability,
you're
if
not
you
gonna be able
can't,
to
if
put
you
aside
can't,
for
you have to
retirement.
make a decision whether or not you're going to get a prescription drug filled at 75 years of age, or whether or not you're going to pay your rent. That's a tough dilemma to be in, and a lot of people have suffered as a result of that.
And it's that population, the blue-collar jobs, I mean, they really suffer from the loss of the employer DB plans because a lot of the manufacturing jobs, those are the ones that had been served by a traditional DB plan. So I agree. I mean, I think that's a major source of the, because you can't sort of invent the savings. I mean, the funds that people can use for savings out of thin air. They're having to take it from somewhere, and I think that's part of the problem. So, any other comments? Well, maybe I
Comments from the committee?
can lapse into my Federal Express commercial speed of talking here.
John, I wouldn't mind hearing, what is the probability of these callers on this is important to us because these are sort of anti-savings issues, some of these callers. I mean,
The DC plans on that slide you've got up now. Should
On
we?
this,
Yeah, does this have traction, this issue?
well, this is an issue that you'll recall we had some spirited discussion about when I was here last year.
Right, right.
And we understand the administration is proposing to resurrect this in the budget.
Yeah.
And basically what it does is it kind of puts a cap on sort of a total lifetime accumulation amount in all these plans, at a level right now would be about 3.4 million that would pay an annual benefit of $205,000. They say, how much can you accumulate that will pay that amount? And when I was here last time, I pointed out that this, as I anticipating your question, I mean, it creates all kinds of reporting problems because you got the STRS level plans, DB, you got the 403B, 457 down at the employer level. And it's just going to be a nightmare. And I think the short answer to your question is it didn't get traction last year, and I don't think it's going to get traction this year because, when you go back, we didn't, this had just come out the night before I came last time, so I didn't have the full history available. When they've tried to do this in the past, even just at the employer level, and they used to have a combined DC limit of how much total you could do, and Congress said, no, wait a second, we tried this. It didn't work. It's too complicated. It's a disincentive to have retirement plans. The employer just ends up being so saddled with it. So,
But all this stuff on this page, John, is this all has to be done by congressional action? It's not through
that's
executive
correct.
branch
I think if he
directive?
tried to he can do my IRA on executive order because that's kind of a
Okay.
no harm, no foul. This one, I think, if he tries to do this on executive order, and I just, the retirement community itself is totally against this. I mean, it's not just the high rollers. I mean, it sounds like a high roller provision. That's the way it's being presented. But I think the fear is this becomes sort of a slippery slope to starting to say how much can be put aside. And so anyway, this is one of several ideas that they have to try to sort of go after the perceived high rollers. I don't think it's going to, it didn't get much interest last time, even among liberal Democrats. So I just wanted to remind you, because in about a month that there's going to be a big fanfare about it. But I don't, especially the history of it. They tried this once before, it didn't work. And so I think that's going to be, it's not going to go anywhere this time around.
Thank you.
But we're keeping an eye on it. I kind of bring these things up because we ought to be reminded that they're out there, but just to keep an eye on them. But I don't think this is going to go anywhere.
Hang on 1 second, John.
Sure.
Tom.
Yeah, I was just asking about that provision. There used to be a surtax on pension distributions in excess of X. Is that what this is, or?
This is basically saying once you get to sort of a total accumulated amount that would be able to pay you an annuity of $200,000, you can't put in any more. So it's a way. It's sort of it. The way that the limits work.
Stops the growth, but it doesn't.
Yeah, the way the limits work now is, DB, it checks on what your total benefit can be, but the DC plan, it limits how much you can put in. You've got a stock market run-up like we've had in the last 3 years, or last year. People are at a high point, but, how do you do this back in 2008? So it sounds good, but it basically just shuts things off. And so, in theory, when the market drops, you can put more in. Well, maybe you don't have more to put in if the market drops. So there are lots of little quirks about it. So I think it's mostly for show. The other proposal he has is to limit the value of the tax-free piece of the employer's of the contribution to 28% rate. So if you're at a rate that's higher than 28%, like 34%, you're taxed on that difference. And actually, he's proposed that in the tax-exempt bond, that the tax exemption is available to you only up to the 20% rate. So if you're an investor at the 35% rate, you're taxed on that piece above. So that hasn't gotten a whole lot of interest either, because it would really affect the tax-exempt bond market.
All right, I think we have to wind up because we're
Okay,
I think
well-
at 12:59 according to my clock. Is that right? So,
Well, we've
John,
got
thank
this.
you
We
so
can
much.
circulate
If you
the
can
hard
share,
copy.
yeah,
Because the rest of
We can send it out electronically.
that'd be great if you can send it electronically. And
Right.
thank you, John, for this.
All right, and as
the-
always, if you have questions or if there are things you're interested in, just send an email to Ed and he can forward it to me about, a particular issue that you're interested in. And
I actually
and we
do
can-
have a couple more things I want to ask you about.
Okay.
So I'll just send you an email later on. Maybe
All
we
right.
can chat while you're still here. So
Okay. Thank you very
thanks,
much.
John. Appreciate it. Thank you, John. So, we go back to you, Dana?
Yep. All right, we will begin the hearing within the next 5 minutes. I'd like to start in a couple, but I think there's people next door that need to make their way to this room.
Sharon, you adjourned the Ledge Committee, right?
The Ledge Committee is now adjourned.
Thank you. If you can thank Councilor Durman for pointing that out.
Did you get a law degree since last time I was like?